and Western churches after the Great Schism, to assert papal leadership over often unruly Western nobles and clergy, and to direct Christian violence away from internal rivalries and towards an external enemy, the infidel, with the ultimate goal of reclaiming Jerusalem, the most sacred city in Christianity, under Muslim rule for 4 centuries. At the council held at Clermont in France, Pope Urban II addressed a gathering of bishops and nobles. He called on knights and soldiers to travel east, defend their embattled brothers in the faith, and liberate Jerusalem. Then he offered something unprecedented, the promise that those who went on this armed pilgrimage purely out of devotion, not greed, could treat the journey as a substitute for earthly penance, in other words, a path to remission of sins. For Europe's warrior elite, who lived with the constant fear of damnation because of their violent lives, this was an electrifying message. Holy war was being presented as a means of salvation. And the destination was Jerusalem, a city that dominated the medieval Christian imagination as the center of the world and the site of Christ's passion and resurrection. The crowd's response was immediate and emotional. Chroniclers record cries of Deus vult, God wills it, echoing through the assembly. Urban's message was then carried across Western Europe by preachers and envoys. A wave of religious enthusiasm followed. Lords, knights, and commoners alike vowed to set out for the Holy Land. They marked their new status by sewing or wearing a cross on their clothing, becoming those who had taken the cross, later known as Crusaders. Some were clearly attracted by prospects of land, wealth, or glory in the East. But for many, the central motive was spiritual, to secure forgiveness, to earn eternal life, even at the cost of hardship and death. They were prepared for a long and perilous journey in the hope of saving their souls. Pope Urban had envisioned a disciplined expedition led by nobles and composed mostly of trained fighting men. But his call resonated far beyond this intended audience. Thousands of peasants, laborers, and townspeople took up the cross. Inspired in large part by a charismatic French preacher, Peter the Hermit, they formed what later chroniclers called the People's Crusade. In the Rhineland, groups of these self-styled crusaders, inflamed by apocalyptic preaching and long-standing prejudices, turned on local Jewish communities. Pogroms followed in cities such as Worms and Mainz. Several thousand Jews were murdered or forced to pay large sums for a chance to survive. Church authorities condemned these attacks, but were unable to prevent them. In the summer of 1096, somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people set out east as part of this People's Crusade. Peter's main following moved down the Danube toward Byzantine territory. They were poorly equipped, lacked discipline, and had no clear logistical plan. When supplies ran short in Hungary, they attacked and looted Christian towns, behavior they repeated once they crossed into Byzantine lands. When they finally reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios, alarmed by their disorder, wasted no time. He arranged for them to be ferried across the Bosporus into Anatolia, keen to remove this unpredictable mass from his capital. There, exposed and disorganized in hostile territory, the majority of the People's Crusade soon fell victim to Turkish forces. Many were ambushed and cut down. The movement effectively ended in disaster. Meanwhile, the Nobles' Crusade, the force Pope Urban II had actually intended, was taking shape. During late 1096 and early 1097, groups of heavily armed and better organized warriors departed from different regions of Europe. From Lorraine, Godfrey of Bouillon, with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin of Boulogne, Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, Count Robert of Flanders, Duke Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, the wealthy Stephen of Blois, from southern France, Count Raymond of Toulouse, accompanied by the papal legate and spiritual leader, Adhemar of Le Puy, from southern Italy, Norman lords Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. These contingents made their way separately through Europe and the Balkans, converging in time on Constantinople, their agreed rendezvous. By the time they assembled, the crusading host may have numbered around 60,000 people, including perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 fighters. It was probably the largest army seen in Europe since the days of the Western Roman Empire. Emperor Alexios had asked for a small force of Western mercenaries to bolster his own army under Byzantine command. What arrived instead was an enormous, largely independent army of Latin nobles and knights. Some, like Bohemond, had previously fought against Byzantium. Alexios now faced the challenge of using this force without losing control of his own empire. He provided the Crusaders with supplies, guides, and transport, but only after their leaders swore oaths of loyalty and promised that former Byzantine territories they recovered would be returned to imperial rule, not kept as their own conquests. Reluctantly, most leaders agreed. Once these conditions were settled, the Crusaders were ferried across the Bosporus into Anatolia. The Crusader host was formidable, especially its heavy cavalry, armored knights on powerful horses, forming roughly 1 in 6 of the total fighting force. But they faced unfamiliar conditions, harsh summer heat, long marches, and the mobile tactics of Turkish cavalry, who favored hit-and-run attacks and horse archery over head-on clashes. The Crusaders, however, had one major advantage: the Muslim Near East was badly divided. The Seljuk realm had splintered, rival Turkish rulers, Arab emirs, and the Shi'a Fatimid caliphs in Egypt all pursued their own interests. Coordination was minimal, and few fully grasped what this new Christian army was or what it aimed to do. The Crusaders' first major target was Nicaea, at that time a key Seljuk city and former Byzantine capital. After a 6-week siege in 1097, Nicaea surrendered, but not directly to the Crusaders. Through negotiations, Alexios arranged for the city to be handed back to his own officials. The Crusaders were denied the chance to storm and plunder it, which many saw as their rightful reward. Resentment grew between Byzantine and Latin allies. From Nicaea, the Crusaders headed deeper into Anatolia in 2 main columns: a vanguard under Bohemond of Taranto, and a rearguard under Godfrey of Bouillon. Near Dorylaeum, Bohemond's force was suddenly confronted by a large Turkish army. Relying on Latin accounts, historians reconstruct the fighting roughly as follows. Bohemond, realizing he faced a major attack, sent a desperate message back to the rearguard asking for immediate support. Then he deployed his knights as a protective screen and drew his infantry together around the wagons and non-combatants in a defensive camp. Waves of Turkish horsemen closed in, encircling the Crusaders. Arrows rained down, javelins and hit-and-run charges probed the line. The knights were gradually driven back onto their own infantry. Casualties mounted over several hours, but the Crusader formation did not break. Meanwhile, Godfrey and the rearguard marched as fast as they could towards the sound of battle. As they approached from a flank that was partially concealed by the terrain, their sudden appearance gave the impression of a new force threatening the Turks with encirclement. With fresh troops arriving and Latin knights massing for a countercharge, the Turks lost heart. A full-scale mounted charge by the Crusader cavalry finally broke them. The Turkish army scattered. The Battle of Dorylaeum was a major victory. It opened the road across central Anatolia and discouraged further large-scale Seljuk resistance. Continuing their march, the Crusaders passed Heraclea, defeating a smaller Turkish force. Then the main army turned east through the rugged highlands of Cappadocia. The journey was punishing. Many pack animals died, supplies ran low, thirst and exhaustion took their toll. At this point, Baldwin of Boulogne and Tancred split off from the main army, probably with an eye on securing independent territories. They moved south into Cilicia, taking Tarsus and other towns. Tancred later rejoined the main army. Baldwin, however, was invited north by Armenian Christian leaders in Edessa. There, through local politics and adoption, he became Count of Edessa, forming the first Latin principality in the east, a Crusader state in all but name. In October 1097, the rest of the army arrived at the mighty city of Antioch. Strategically and symbolically, Antioch was crucial, a major stronghold on the road to Jerusalem. But it was also vast, heavily defended, and located partly on a steep mountain slope, making it extremely difficult to encircle or storm. The Crusaders settled in for a long siege. Through autumn and winter, they camped outside the walls with limited food. As supplies dwindled, famine and disease spread. Men and animals starved. Some crusaders deserted. Sporadic shipments of grain and reinforcements arrived by sea, often via Cyprus, but never enough to fully relieve the crisis. A relief army from Aleppo under Radwan was defeated near the Lake of Antioch, but the larger problem remained. The Crusaders were slowly starving. In March 1098, a welcome change came when a Western fleet reached the region, bringing reinforcements and supplies. Yet Antioch still refused to fall. Eventually, a deal was struck in secret. Bohemond negotiated with a commander responsible for one of the towers on the southern wall, a man apparently willing to be bribed. One night, Bohemond and a small group of his men climbed up the tower with his help. At dawn, they opened the nearby gate, and Crusader soldiers flooded into the city. Street fighting turned into a massacre. Many of Antioch's Muslim inhabitants were killed, others fled to the citadel, which remained in Turkish hands and continued to resist. Antioch the city had fallen, but the Crusaders' ordeal was not yet over. A massive counterattack was already on the way. A coalition army under Kur-Bugga, the Atabeg of Mosul, advanced on Antioch. He first besieged Edessa, but soon abandoned that effort to march south and contain the Crusaders. By the time Kur-Bugga's troops surrounded Antioch, the Crusaders were exhausted, badly underfed, and now themselves besieged. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who might have relieved them, had received misleading reports that the crusade was finished. Fearing a Turkish counteroffensive, he turned back towards Constantinople. The Crusaders could expect no imperial help. Inside the city, morale reached a low point. It was then that a Provençal priest claimed to discover a sacred relic, the Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross. Whether genuine or not, the effect on the army's spirits was dramatic. Many took it as a sign of divine favor and renewed their determination to fight. Despite being outnumbered, the Crusader leaders decided on a bold move. They would sally out and confront Kur-Bugga's army in open battle. Confident that God was on their side, and buoyed by visions and prophecy, they marched out of Antioch's gates and formed up for combat. To the surprise of many, the Muslim coalition army did not hold firm. Disputes among its leaders, combined with the ferocity of the Crusader assault, led to a breakdown in unity. As the Frankish cavalry charged, sections of Kur-Bugga's army began to retreat, then scatter. The Atabeg's camp was set on fire, and he withdrew. The defenders in the citadel, realizing that no relief would come, soon surrendered. Against all odds, Antioch was fully in Crusader hands. In 1098, while the Crusaders lingered in northern Syria, a new player moved into Palestine. Fatimid forces from Egypt recaptured Jerusalem from the Arsacid Turks. The Fatimid vizier Al-Afdal regarded the Seljuks as his primary rivals and even explored the possibility of accommodation with the Crusaders. But the Latin leaders had only one ultimate goal: Jerusalem itself. The Crusaders spent months around Antioch, resting, arguing, and raiding for supplies. Some high-ranking nobles, including Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois, abandoned the expedition and returned to Europe, convinced it would fail. A major political rupture followed. Bohemond claimed Antioch as his own principality, refusing to hand it back to the Byzantines, citing Alexios's absence and broken promises as justification. His seizure of Antioch angered other leaders and violated the oaths made in Constantinople. The crusade also lost a key stabilizing figure when Bishop Adhema of Lipui died of illness. Without him, disputes worsened. During this period, Crusader forces also carried out another bloody massacre at Marat al-Num, where many civilians were killed in brutal fashion. Ultimately, pressure from the rank and file, those who had taken vows to reach Jerusalem, forced the leaders to move on. Bohemond stayed behind to consolidate his rule in Antioch, now a semi-independent Norman state in the east. The rest of the crusading host turned south. As they entered Fatimid-controlled territory, some local rulers chose pragmatism, offering money and supplies in exchange for peace. Others abandoned settlements in advance, leaving scorched earth. Wells were poisoned, orchards cut down, and livestock driven away to deny the Crusaders food and water. On the 7th of June 1099, after 3 years of marching and fighting, the Crusaders finally glimpsed Jerusalem. Many fell to their knees, praying and weeping at the sight of the holy city. But their situation remained difficult. Their numbers had shrunk to roughly 12,000 fighting men, far too few to completely surround the city. Food and water were limited. They would need to rely on a direct assault. The land around Jerusalem provided little timber for siege works. The Crusaders' first attempt, relying on basic ladders and small makeshift devices, failed on the 13th of June. The defenders repelled them with ease. A partial solution arrived from the sea. A small Genoese fleet reached the port of Jaffa. Blocked by the Fatimid navy from full operations, the sailors dismantled some of their own ships and transported the wood overland to Jerusalem. Additional timber was gathered from the surrounding countryside. From this material, the Crusaders built 2 large siege towers and other engines. These towering wooden structures could be rolled up to the walls, allowing attackers to cross onto the battlements. One tower was assigned to Raymond of Toulouse in the southwest, the other to Godfrey of Bouillon in the north. On the 8th of July, the Crusaders performed a solemn religious procession around Jerusalem's walls, barefoot and singing psalms, seeking divine favor before the final attack. The ceremony ended with a service on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city. On the night before the main assault, Godfrey had his tower secretly moved along the line to a section of wall he believed to be less well defended. At dawn on the 15th of July 1099, the final attack began. Under intense fire, Godfrey's men edged their siege tower close enough to lower drawbridges onto the wall. After fierce hand-to-hand combat, they secured a foothold. Soon they broke through into the city. Once the defenses collapsed, the assault turned into a massacre. In the intense religious atmosphere of the moment, many Crusaders believed they were instruments of divine judgment. They killed Muslim and Jewish inhabitants alike, men, women, and children. Contemporary accounts describe horrific scenes of slaughter and looting. By the standards of the age, the violence was extreme but not unprecedented, yet it left a deep mark on Muslim and Jewish memory. Despite the carnage, the Crusaders had achieved their objective. Jerusalem was in Latin Christian hands. A few weeks later, at the Battle of Ascalon, they defeated a Fatimid army sent from Egypt to retake the city, securing their immediate position. Having fulfilled their vows, the majority of Crusaders then returned to Europe. Only a small corps, perhaps around 300 knights, along with infantry and settlers, stayed behind to defend the new kingdom. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the first ruler of Jerusalem. He declined the title king in a city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, instead adopting the title advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Ironically, the man whose sermon had set all this in motion, Pope Urban II, died in 1099, just weeks after Jerusalem's fall, before the news reached him. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, several Latin states were established in the region: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These Crusader states were small, militarized enclaves, dependent on constant reinforcement from Europe and perpetually surrounded by more populous Muslim neighbors. For a time, the disunity of the Muslim world allowed them to survive. But that situation would not last. In the decades that followed, powerful Muslim leaders would emerge to unite large parts of the region and launch their own campaigns under the banner of jihad. The Levant would be the stage for nearly 2 centuries of intermittent holy war. In response, Western Europe would send more crusades east, some famous, others forgotten. Yet none would so dramatically achieve its aims, or leave such a brutal legacy, as the First Crusade.